pleasure to hand you over to Graham and Daniel. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, it's very exciting to be here with Graham, who, when did we originally meet? Like, it was over 10 years ago.
At least 10 years ago.
Yeah. And when I was writing my book on 2012, you actually gave me some tremendously helpful editing advice.
Thank you.
Which I remember,
2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl.
Exactly,
Yeah. And your former book was Breaking Open the Hand.
Yeah, exactly.
Which had a huge impact on me. So we can exchange compliments.
Well, and when I was writing 2012 was when I really got into Graham's work, particularly your early work on, Fingerprints of the Gods, on ancient civilizations, and as we'll discuss later, kind of like one of the kind of prospects that the Turingham Initiative is exploring is kind of the future of psychedelic research, what we can learn about these other dimensions of consciousness and the possibility that they're even like entities and that people come into contact with, whether those have any reality in any sense. And so your work is such an interesting starting place to discuss that, because you've covered everything from these ancient civilizations which were more mythological based and maybe more initiatory in their focus, to in Middle Age kind of rediscovering phenomenologically these experiences of altered states of consciousness. So maybe we could start. If you could just maybe articulate. You have a sort of a basic thesis. We were just talking about it, about kind of the idea that maybe there were these ancient civilizations, and then there was Egypt, and where we are now in a way. Yeah.
Okay, I suppose my central issue and central focus for well over 20 years now has been, is it possible that there has been a major forgotten episode in human history? I couldn't do my work were it not for academic archaeologists, but at the same time I have my doubts about academic archaeology. And all too often the picture we're presented with by archaeology is that they've got the story of the human past sewn up, and that there's really nothing new to add. And I think that's a mistake of logic, because actually if you follow archaeology, you can see that what is touted in one generation as a fact is overthrown in the next generation. So I think actually we should regard almost every conclusion of archaeology as tentative, rather than as a definite fact. And the conclusion of archaeology is that civilization began about 5,500 years ago. That's when we start seeing the first signs of what could be called a civilization, which is a word rooted in the word city, actually, that cities start to develop. So we look at Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and they've been presented as the first civilizations, and all other civilizations descended from that. And my question has been, okay, great, good information, but let's leave a little door open to consider another possibility. A possibility that is reflected in myths and traditions all around the world, that there was a former high civilization much earlier, and that it was destroyed in some gigantic cataclysm, and that it somehow passed down a legacy which was picked up by these later civilizations, and which perhaps might explain why in ancient Egypt the best stuff is the oldest, and it starts to deteriorate after that. So my role has been to offer alternative information on the possibility of a forgotten chapter in the human story, and that's what I've continued to do. And I did have a diversion very much into altered states of consciousness with a book called Supernatural, and really I got into that book because I was interested in cave art, and then I found that really the most convincing explanation of cave art was that those artists had experienced visionary states and were depicting their visions on the walls of the cave, and that's what led me into that inquiry. And I'm now coming to a place where I think if we talk about a lost civilization, we must also talk about visionary states.
In Fingerprints of the Gods, you were focusing on these ancient civilizations in the sense that they had maybe a kind of understanding of catastrophes or something that was going to happen, roughly in our time. Maybe related to, the Mayan calendars, predictions around 2012, or let's say this period. And obviously we are seeing catastrophic things happening around the world right now with what's happening ecologically. We're losing so many species, and global warming is accelerating, and so on. Yeah, but when you wrote The Supernatural, I had a sense that maybe you had a shift where you recognized that maybe this thing that you've been anticipating as a kind of exterior, kind of physical event was actually more of an inner event.
I think it's both. If we want to go back to the great granddaddy of lost civilizations, that would be Plato. Because Plato actually is the single source we have for the story of Atlantis. All other references to Atlantis are secondary and derivative from Plato. And Plato makes it very clear that humanity, the humanity of that lost civilization, the way that it behaved, was part of what brought down the slapdown from the universe. In other words, what he's saying is that there was a time when Atlantis was a beautiful civilization, entirely focused on the nurture of spirit, generous, kind, giving, supportive, but that somehow a darkness entered in, and that they became cruel and harsh, that they imposed their power around the world. And in a ringing phrase, they ceased to wear their prosperity with moderation. In other words, they became arrogant. And Plato's implication is that arrogance, that cruelty, brought retribution from the universe down upon them, to put them back in their place and show them what is real. And I can simply report that that's what Plato said, but if I were myself to look at a civilization that ticks all the boxes for the next lost civilization, it would be ours, with our arrogance, our cruelty, our imposition of power all around the world, so on and so forth.
So you're sort of suggesting, almost like an alchemical idea, like as above, so below, that somehow as the human world goes off track, that somehow creates perturbations in what we experience as a physical reality?
I'm not suggesting that. Plato suggested that. I think it's an interesting idea. I can't claim to be able to prove that idea one way or another, but I think it's an interesting idea worth following. That our own behavior is not without consequences beyond the human world. That we are part of a universe. And that if we're out of balance with the universe, then sooner or later the universe is going to be out of balance with us.
That is almost like a religious idea in a strange way.
I suppose it is, but which religion, Daniel?
How far back would you place this ancient civilization, and what type of evidence is there that something like that exists? I mean, it would seem like, now they have all the, genetic information, so they can trace, that we were, 20,000 years, we came across the Bering Straits, and I think 40,000 years ago, we all descend from like one family in Africa. I mean, unless you're saying that in itself is...
That's all changed. Okay. That's all radically changed in the last 4 or 5 years.
Oh yeah, okay.
Completely differently. First of all, if we were sitting here 2 years ago, I would be saying to you that the earliest evidence of anatomically modern humans was 195,000 years ago. Now it's 350,000 years ago. That's one of the changes. Secondly, maybe if it was 3-4 years ago, I would be agreeing that our ancestors interbred with Neanderthals, but I wouldn't know anything about the Denisovans. We now have another human species whose DNA we carry, and they're called the Denisovans. Why? Because the genetic profile was produced from a pinky bone found in a cave in Siberia that was once lived in by a monk called Denis. And it became called Denisova Cave on his account, and it turns out that cave was occupied by Neanderthals, it was occupied by anatomically modern humans, and it was occupied by Denisovans at different periods and sometimes overlapping. So we're suddenly finding that the human story is getting much more complicated than it was. Then secondly, and we discussed this briefly, concerning the peopling of the Americas, there is a huge new story coming out, and I've just spent the last 2 years working very closely on this. A very significant discovery was made in Southern California just outside San Diego. Actually, back in the 1990s, a mastodon site was discovered where the remains of a mastodon lay in the sediment. And when they investigated this mastodon site, they found evidence of human activity on the bones, that this creature had been scavenged by human beings. But when they did the dating, it was extremely disturbing. It was 130,000 years ago. And the story has been that the Americas were not inhabited until 13,000 years ago. So suddenly we have 10 times as much. Now in the interim there have been other discoveries, you're quite correct. Bluefish Caves in Canada, 20,000 years ago. I went down to South Carolina, met Al Goodyear on the Topper site, 50,000 years ago. But all of these supposedly earlier sites have been rejected by the mainstream and said, no. There was a long time, it was the view that the first culture in the Americas was a culture called the Clovis culture. They didn't call themselves that, that's what we call them. And that they arrived in America across the Bering Strait through the ice-free corridor 13,600 years ago, and then mysteriously 12,800 years ago, they vanish. And at the same time, all the megafauna in North America vanish as well. And actually, if you go to a site like Murray Springs in Arizona, which I've done, you will see a black line about a hand's width thick running through a draw. And that's called the black mat, and that was wrapped like shrink wrap over the top of the remains of the last megafauna and of the last of the Clovis culture. And nobody really has disputed for a very long time that some kind of cataclysm took place then. Something very bad happened in North America. It killed off 35 genera of mega animals, and it got rid of the prominent human culture in America at that time. And I think that's the period we need to be looking at. 12,800 years ago is the beginning of an episode called the Younger Dryas. The world is coming out of the Ice Age. Then suddenly it's plunged back into a deep freeze. Normally, when you get a climate change that causes a deep freeze, you would not get a massive release of meltwater into the world's ocean. But right at the beginning of this episode, we have a huge release of meltwater into the world's ocean, and that's why the world gets cold, because it stops the Gulf Stream in its tracks, and the whole global temperature collapses. So what kind of agent is it that could release an enormous amount of meltwater from the ice cap, and then suddenly everything clamps down into a deep freeze? And there's an enormous amount of work being done by a group of more than 60 scientists. They've published in all the major journals. Their work is controversial, it's disputed. They call themselves the Comet Research Group, and the strong suggestion is that the Earth was hit by a comet swarm around 12,800 years ago, and that the epicenter of the cataclysm was North America, and that those comet impacts created enough energy and enough heat to create partial melting of the ice cap, and then you get this incredible damage done in areas like the Channeled Scablands up in the northwest. The evidence of flooding is compelling, and it's not just there. This is 50 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface that is affected by this. It's a giant event. I think that's when we lost part of the human story.
I mean, according to the ancient Egyptian chronicles, right? It goes back much further. It goes back like 10,000 BC or something like that.
Well, there's a notion in the ancient Egyptian system which they call Zep Tepi, which means the first time, and that's when they say the origins of their civilization took place. That mysterious individuals appeared who taught them certain things, and this was the beginning. They called them the gods. That this was the time of the gods. It was the time when the gods walked the earth and taught humanity how to live a civilized life. And when you track that back, and it's a complicated process to do so, archaeoastronomy is one of the best ways to do it. We find ourselves around about 12,500 to 12,800 years ago. The age of Leo, when the constellation of Leo rises due east at the equinox, when the Great Sphinx is looking directly at its own celestial counterpart on the equinox.
And so what provides evidence or support for the prospect that the types of visionary plants that we've now kind of rediscovered were being used by this ancient global civilization?
The first conclusion I've come to investigating this is that if we are talking about a lost civilization, first of all, we should not imagine that it's us. It's something very different from us. This is what I think one of the mistakes that historians and archaeologists make, is that when they look at the past, they tend to be looking in a mirror rather than looking through a window, and they see us reflected in the past. So they're looking for a civilization very like ours, which was involved in material tech, which is involved in the use of mechanical advantage. I mean, many of the mysteries that archaeologists confront, for example, the 170-ton blocks that are 350 feet above the ground inside the Great Pyramid, the incredible fitting together of the giant megaliths at Sacsayhuaman. I've not yet seen archaeologists come up with a convincing explanation of that. There was a big headlines about archaeologists discover how huge stones were moved. They made the sand wet and slid the stones along in the sand. Well, okay, fine, but how'd you get them 350 feet in the air with wet sand? That's the first problem for me. And then secondly, trying to explain this three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle that is Sacsayhuaman. If we only use techniques of mechanical advantage to try and explain it, we don't get a satisfactory answer. So I have to come to the conclusion that there were earlier ways of doing things. We don't know the potential of the human creature. We have handed everything over to machines. And when you hand everything over to machines, you don't need to use the power of the mind to move stuff. You're doing it all mechanically. So I start to speculate, maybe there was an earlier civilization that did things a different way. Maybe, we hear these anecdotal stories of telekinesis, telepathy. They're more than anecdotal, actually. I mean, anybody who's worked a lot with ayahuasca will know that telepathy is actually really normal, and that you can receive messages and send them to other people in the room. It doesn't happen every time, but it's there, and it's part of it. So I don't rubbish and ridicule claims of psi powers.
What about telekinesis, Graham? Have you had any of that?
Telekinesis. Well, I've heard that again. Anecdotal reports of telekinesis. I've not actually witnessed it myself. I know the Tibetan story. The little Tibetan story about a group of Tibetan monks levitating a fairly substantial rock using sound. It begins to sound a bit like telekinesis, but my feeling is that the existing mechanical explanations do not explain a lot of the gigantic building problems of the past. And therefore, by definition, we're looking at a civilization that did things differently from ours. And then secondly, really the use of visionary plants and plant allies, I think that this was a worldwide phenomenon going back very far. I'm absolutely certain that the cave artists, who were Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers without a doubt, were experiencing visionary states. Whether they got into that with psilocybes or whether they got into it through rhythmic dancing, whatever they were doing, they were depicting the experiences of visions on the walls of those caves. And I don't dispute that the world of 13, 17, 20, 25,000 years ago was largely populated by hunter-gatherers. I think that that's absolutely the case. What I'm suggesting is that a civilization which had done different things, not just hunter-gathering, but which had evolved out of hunter-gathering, coexisted with them. And a lot of people say, well, that's just impossible. To which I can only answer, I'm sorry, that's the case today. We live in a world today where there are many hunter-gatherer cultures still. They're under great pressure. They're facing a threatening situation. But you go to Namibia, you go to the Amazon jungle, and you're going to find hunter-gatherers who are coexisting on this planet with a highly advanced technological civilization. Some of them don't even know we're here. So I think it was like that before.
Or they know, but they don't want to know.
Or they don't want to know, which might be very wise, yeah.
Yeah, I guess, was The Sign of the Seal your first major work? That was, I think, because that was when you were starting as The Economist, you were in Africa.
Okay.
You started to explore the Ark of the Covenant.
I did. It happened like this. I was a journalist. I was based in East Africa, lived in Nairobi, and my beat included Ethiopia. And going to Ethiopia regularly, I came across the Ethiopian claim to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant. And initially, I just thought, this is really interesting. This is a story. I haven't seen anybody else telling this story. And I started to look into it. I interviewed some of the leading academics. They said, nah, it's all rubbish. The Ethiopians just made it up to glorify the Solomonic dynasty. There's no meaning to it whatsoever. But then I find, as I'm on the ground, boots on the ground, traveling around Ethiopia, I find that there's a substantial community of Ethiopian Jews, Old Testament Jews. They're not they don't know the Talmud. The Torah is their thing. They're called in Ethiopia the Falashas. They prefer to call themselves the Beta Israel. They're practicing Old Testament Judaism. They don't have rabbis. They have priests. They sacrifice rams. What's going on here? Why do we have this ancient Judaism in a country which is claiming to possess the Ark of the Covenant? And the academics are telling me it's all rubbish, and I suppose this is where my slight disrespect for academics began to come in, because on the ground I'm being told something completely different. And then I look into the question of what happened to the Ark. What does the Bible say? Well, the Bible doesn't say anything. It just vanishes from the story. Archaeologists say it must have been taken away by the Babylonians when they occupied Jerusalem, but there's no evidence for that whatsoever. And then I discovered, in fact, through interviewing a biblical scholar in Jerusalem, Menahem Haram, that weirdly, in 650 BC, which is a good 80 years before the Babylonian invasion, that a Jewish temple was built in Upper Egypt on the island of Elephantina near Aswan. And this is unprecedented. Menahem made that point very clear. This was the first temple period. Why would there be another temple outside of Jerusalem at that time? And the only reason he could think of would be for the reason the first temple was built, which is, quote, as an house of rest for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. And he pointed out that that was the time when an apostate monarch sat upon the throne of Jerusalem. An idol was installed in the Holy of Holies. The Ark could not have been left there. And I just followed the trail. Aswan is halfway to Ethiopia. It's on the River Nile. You keep following that Nile River and you're going to end up in Lake Tana, the source of the Blue Nile. And Lake Tana is the center of the Ethiopian Judaic population. So what I began to see was a story that made sense, that the past had been misrepresented and that the Ethiopian claim could be stood up to a substantial extent. And that led me onwards into many other inquiries.
Yeah, I mean, I got fascinated by that book and correlating that with this work of Nassim Haramein, he had a long series called The Resonance Project, where he also kept coming back to the Ark. I guess this idea which emerged in his work and your work was that it might have been a piece of ancient technology. Maybe the gods that the Egyptians talked about were, extraterrestrials. Maybe they lived potentially, or
I don't do extraterrestrials.
Interdimensional.
Interdimensional is more interesting, I have to say. Let's pause on that for a moment, because it's interesting. I take a lot of flack from, the extreme conservatives in academia, but I also do from the UFO lobby as well. I've never seen the need for an extraterrestrial civilization which could cross interstellar space to explain the mysteries of the human past. I'm really sure the universe is full of life, and maybe we have been visited, but I just don't need them to explain that. It's a much simpler, more direct explanation is that the level of ability of our ancestors is much higher than they've been given credit for. So, for me, it's always been the survivors of a lost civilization rather than extraterrestrials who we need to look for a convincing explanation of the mysteries that we confront. But you're right, the Ark does sound like some kind of device. I mean, right from the very moment that Moses ascends Mount Sinai and is given the blueprint, he's given a blueprint and it's spelt out in great detail. And then it goes down and it's built according to the blueprint, and then the tablets of stone, after being smashed and replaced, are placed inside it. And then suddenly it becomes energized with this power, and anybody who touches it gets zapped.
Unless they're kind of initiated.
Unless they're initiated. But it even killed its own bearers. There are occasions, not in the Bible, but in Jewish legends, which describe that happening as well. And it's hard to resist the feeling that we're dealing with something that we don't understand here, something real. And I did consider that possibility and look into it.
I think both you and this has always been a big interest of mine. I hope you guys are interested along with me. Potentially that was the device that was in the Great Pyramid, right? That's what Nassim looks
Nassim
like.
may say that. I have no reason to say that or not to say it. There's a sarcophagus inside the so-called King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, and some people, maybe Nassim, have suggested that the dimensions of the interior of the sarcophagus are similar to the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant. Great, but it's not my thing.
I finally had an opportunity to visit the Great Pyramid last year, and it was really, it's definitely a very numinous experience. It definitely beggars our kind of understanding of why anybody would go to. I mean, it wasn't a tomb. Obviously, the tombs are outside of it.
Yeah.
I know your perspective has been that it was kind of an initiation chamber.
I believe it was. I think that we cannot disconnect the Great Pyramid from the ancient Egyptian books of the dead. That's a general term. If you want to look at the oldest so-called funerary literature from ancient Egypt, you're looking at the pyramid texts. And they're called the pyramid texts because they are written, literally inscribed in hieroglyphs on the walls of pyramids from the 5th and 6th dynasties. But at Giza, we're dealing with the 4th dynasty. And I believe that the 4th dynasty pyramids are built atop of much older structures, that they are a renovation or a remaking of something much older. For example, I don't know if you got down to the subterranean chamber, right at the bottom, 100 feet vertically beneath the base of the Great Pyramid. I think that's a prehistoric monument. I think that goes way back before the 4th dynasty. It's one of the reasons why the Great Pyramid was built there. I just lost my track. How did we get onto this? Smoking too much dope.
Well, I guess I've been interested in this idea that
the numinous experience of the Great Pyramid.
Okay, fair enough.
You bet. It's a numinous experience. It is an extraordinary experience. Modern Egypt does its best to ruin that experience for us in every possible way. But if you can get the Great Pyramid to yourself, if you can climb the Great Pyramid, which has been my privilege to do 5 times, be up there on top of that magic carpet, 4 o'clock in the morning, looking down on the city of Cairo, feel that energy bubbling up underneath you. It's an amazing, extraordinary place. And it is definitely connected to beliefs about the afterlife. The ancient Egyptian afterlife journey took place through a realm that they called the Duat. And the Duat is at once a region of the heavens and a kind of 3-dimensional physical underworld. And we have images of it, which are painted on the walls of later tombs, for example, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. If you analyze those images, they look just like the interior structure of the Great Pyramid. Ascending galleries, descending corridors, chambers, the whole works. It actually looks like a schema. And what you find at the center of the Duat, in the 5th division of the Duat, where the eternal destiny of the soul is decided, what you find is a sphinx and a pyramid. And this is all taking place within that. So both in terms of the exterior and of the interior, I think we're looking at a kind of practice zone for the afterlife journey. Our culture says there is no life after death. We are just meat. We are meat robots. There is no purpose to us. We're completely accidental. I'm not saying that. That's what our scientists say. People like Richard Dawkins, the author of the book called The Selfish Gene, will tell you that there is no life after death. How does he know that? How can he possibly know that?
Because for him, consciousness is purely an epiphenomena of the meat of the brain.
Exactly, an epiphenomenon of brain activity. But we don't know that either. We don't really understand how the brain works. We cannot say that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. We can say that consciousness is connected to the brain in some way, but exactly how, we can't say. So it would be a foolish person who were to rule out the possibility that consciousness can survive death. And if that's the case, and if we go on after physical death, and if we then need to, in some way, account for the lives we've lived, let's consider this. The Buddhists say this too. It's a precious opportunity to be born in a human body. Born in a human body, you have so much more power of choice and action than you would do if you were born as a fruit fly. And therefore, you've been given an incredible gift. What did you do with that gift? How did you use it? To me, that's the real question that's being asked in the ancient Egyptian judgment scene. And were that to be the case, and we cannot rule out that it is the case, were that to be the case, then it would make a whole lot of sense to prepare for it and to live your life in accord with that notion. And that's what I think the ancient Egyptians did.
I mean, it could have also potentially been multifunctional.
Yes.
I mean, one aspect of it we know, like in indigenous cultures, maybe there were initiations to gain like psychic abilities, for instance. And maybe the pharaoh were in a way like the greatest magicians or wizards of the society, the ones who had the most access to these other types of powers.
Definitely.
I was very interested by going back to, I understand your critique of this idea of literal extraterrestrial civilizations. Have you ever heard of this guy, Hank Wesselman?
Yeah, I've met him.
Okay, so he's a shamanic teacher, and he has an interesting essay online about going to the Great Pyramid, being able to do a ritual with his shamanic group, trance drumming. He lay in the sarcophagus, and he had a full out-of-body experience where he suddenly found himself in the body of an alien, a tall alien woman, dressed a little bit like an Egyptian figurine or deity, on another planet that he described as a vertical cave complex. That this alien was in touch with all these other beings who were living around this complex. They were in telepathic communication. They were anticipating his arrival. And he was given kind of a transmission during his time there that essentially this was an alien civilization, maybe Sirius-based or something, that we once had a psychic connection to, and that the pyramid was actually a communication device that gave us access to them. They were meant to be kind of like our stewards or shepherds. They'd gone through some of the crises that we'd gone through, but they'd come out the other side into kind of like a post-technological reality. And then he was kind of shuttled back over here. I found that fascinating.
Very interesting.
In terms of collecting
and
data.
Hank is a very smart guy, and he's deeply experienced in this area. It's a very interesting line to take. To me, I don't really mind whether they come from Sirius or Alpha Centauri or wherever they are. The issue is consciousness. That's the fundamental issue, and I suspect if there are other physical entities, just as we are physical entities, that they run through the same kind of consciousness problems that we do. The problem of being conscious at all, and what that ultimately means. But I think that the idea of communication with other levels of reality is a very interesting one to inquire into as well. By all means, there's all kinds of ways of looking into the possibilities of physical extraterrestrial civilizations. But what about entities which exist at a completely different level of vibration to us? I think that's where we come to the subject of this discussion, really, of this whole event, which is what is going on in the DMT experience when we encounter intelligent entities who communicate with us and who have stuff to say to us. And what's more, they seem to be aware of us all the time, whereas we're only aware of them when we retune the receiver wavelength of the brain, which is what I think we're doing with DMT. And then we come to the question, to me much more fruitful than actually seeking for physical aliens, is can we refine this communication? Can we explore it further and see where it leads? At the moment, mainstream science is saying now those entities are just fictions of the brain, they're nothing at all, but they don't know that. And what needs to be done is detailed, really scientific work into exploring this. We need volunteers. I know a couple of guys down in Boulder, Utah, who went out into the desert every night and smoked DMT. Every night, because you don't build up tolerance with DMT. And they would meet each other on the other side, and they would travel through this landscape, and they would encounter entities and compare notes. And it seems to me that's the way to go with this inquiry. We may one day reach the physical technology where we can reach out to Sirius or Alpha Centauri, but right now we have the technology to reach out to what may be parallel dimensions of existence. And yet our societies, apart from Rick Strassman's amazing work, very little real work is being done on this. The group that met at Tyringham 3 years ago included a gentleman called Andrew Gallimore, who's a biochemist. And Andrew is looking at ways to, and in fact has found ways, to keep a person in the DMT state for hours, not just for 20 minutes or 10 minutes, but for hours, a constant drip infusion of DMT. I think that's what you need to do. It would take tremendous courage. It would take real will. But we need to explore that realm. And I think the ancients were exploring it.
Yeah, I mean, and then also, you know, I mean, there was one, was he an astrophysicist, Roy? The guy who was with us at Turingham, who, what's that? Fascinating guy, who actually was open, even though he himself had never explored psychedelics, to this idea that, you know, we have string theory positing 10 dimensions of space-time. You know, maybe these compounds are ways we can access these like other dimensions, these hyperdimensions where space and time functions differently.
Yeah. It makes sense to me, and at least it makes sense to inquire into it in a very serious, committed way, with the kind of funding that other scientific research gets. So, because if this is the case, if there are entities that aren't just figments of the brain, but are real and have an interest in us and have a message for us, we need to know everything about it that we can possibly know.
But aren't there also, I mean, just thinking out loud now, there could be some significant dangers in that. I mean, I'm thinking about
Definitely.
You know, Aleister Crowley, who actually in the, you know, in the Great Pyramid encountered, you know, a being who channeled this information to him, and then he ended up, you know, going mad, kind of becoming a drug addict, ending up like a dissolute, you know, heroin addict. I mean, just because there's an entity out there, I mean, you know, from our scientific framework, we're going to be so excited to verify that, but what if it's an entity who doesn't actually have our best interests at heart? How are we going to then...
I think that's a really great point, and you're absolutely right, and nobody venturing into the DMT realm or DMT mediated through the ayahuasca vine should imagine that it's all sweetness and light and roses, because it isn't. It's there can be some deeply challenging and utterly threatening encounters which take place in that state. And just as there is what we call good and evil over here, my experience is it's over there too, and that there are entities that absolutely do not have our interest at heart. And I've seen people very close to me grievously harmed following ayahuasca sessions. So there is no doubt in my mind.
You mean by the experiences they had?
I don't only mean psychically harmed, but physically harmed also.
Through some type of occult attack or something? Or?
Yeah, I believe that's what took place. In this case, it involved a person in the group who seemed to be channeling some higher power that was very dangerous. But
just to go back quickly to Rick Strassman, I mean, I thought, do most people here know about his work? Okay, so I mean, I'm not going to review it, but you know, when he was doing his study, which was the first kind of government-approved study of psychedelics with human subjects for like 35 years or something, you know, he ended up stopping the study early. I think his wife got cancer, and then he went to a psychic, and the psychic said, well, you know, as a result of opening the doors in this unprotected way, these entities are coming in and they're dangerous, and they could cause physical harm.
That's why we need to learn from the best of shamanism how to handle this. And we are woefully ill-equipped in the West to handle this at the moment. I mean, this is where really we need to sit at the feet of hunter-gatherer cultures who still have shamanism, where that shamanism has not been polluted by Western commercial interests, and learn from what they have to teach us, because that fundamentally is what the shaman is doing. He or she is managing those powerful and negative entities. And sometimes, unfortunately, they are harnessing those negative energies and turning them upon one another. This is, I suppose, like any great voyage of discovery, it is a voyage that involves risks. And those risks might even be fatal for the individual concerned. There's no doubt about that. But no exploration that's worth its while can be done without taking on those risks. What we need to do is get some sense of exactly what the risks are.
I thought it'd be interesting to take a few questions, but I was just struck by kind of, you know, we're discussing kind of like opening a portal to try to kind of connect with these other entities and discover their validity. At the same time, humanity is like fixated on kind of creating a new type of consciousness or sentience through purely technological means of artificial intelligence.
Transhumanism.
What?
From what little I know about it, transhumanism, I really feel very uncomfortable with it. The idea of extending this physical life endlessly through mechanical aids, if that's what's involved, we already have a system for that. It's called reincarnation. And I'd rather shuffle the deck and come back to a different experience than just continue this one forever.
We should take a vote. How many people would prefer to shuffle the deck, come back in a different form? How many would just continue this one for as long as possible?
I'm definitely in the come back in a different form. I think that I think death is the beginning of the next great adventure.
I can see that, but I think human life is too short. We need to extend it a bit.
Okay.
We only start getting good at it, and then we're already like falling apart.
Yeah.
Let's take a few questions. We got this man here. Is there a mic for? Okay, we got a mic coming. Tell me your name again. I'm sorry. The woman with the mic. What's your name again?
Ligela.
Ligela. Nice name.
Thank you, Ligela. So, Graham, thank you so much for being here. It is a great honor to have you here.
Thank you.
And I was walking around Rockefeller Center, and I saw those sort of menacing-looking statues of Prometheus. Well, that one's not that menacing. Atlas, a little bit more menacing, but the most menacing is the, what do you call it, like the creator, the one with that compass, the demiurge, if you will. I don't really know what his official name is.
Let's try to be quick.
Okay, oh, sure, okay. So what I'm trying to figure out right now is, in the past, there could be two different ways of looking at the downfall of these ancient civilizations. One way is through hubris, through maybe Rudolf Steiner's interpretation of people getting psychic powers and abusing them, but the other way could be jealousy of some higher gods like Zeus in regards to somebody like Prometheus stealing the fire and giving them to the humans he created, or Atlas. And I'm curious, through looking at all the ancient civilizations, all the mythologies, how much do you see things being in one corner versus the other corner? Hubris versus jealousy from higher entities at the humans who now are competing with them.
Well, I'll answer that with Plato's words. I think that it's a very grave mistake for any human culture that becomes prosperous not to wear its prosperity with moderation. The moment arrogance starts to enter into the picture, I think we are inviting a response from the universe. That's my personal view, almost a religious view, although I have no religion as such.
Let's take another question. Maybe this woman over here. Ligela.
Hi, thanks so much. I wanted to hear just a little bit more about some of this bodily harm that you mentioned that came to some of the people sitting in your circle. Of course, I've read about the darts that the Shipibo chiefs, shamans, what have you, would give to each other as a jealous measure. But I am kind of curious about the sort of otherworldly harm that came to people that were just sitting. How did it what kind of evidence did it show?
Well, physically it evidenced in a massive, more than year-long attack of shingles on this person whose life was just utterly devastated for a year by what followed that ceremony. It's taken great courage on her behalf to go back to ayahuasca. But Mother Ayahuasca has made it clear to her that she cannot control all the forces in the universe. As a matter of fact, that lesson was from Mother Ayahuasca was, this is what I have to deal with every day. This evil and this darkness. And it can come down into our plane. This person had her life totally thrown off balance by what happened in that ceremony. And we understand how it happened. We know exactly what happened. I'm not going to go into too many details, but what I can tell you is that the effects were both psychic and physical, and that they lasted for about a year, but that the healing came through ayahuasca. It came through another ceremony with ayahuasca, with a different shaman, and with the love of the group focused upon this person. And that brought her out of this terrible slough that she had fallen into.
But I would say generally in shamanic cultures, it's recognized that any kind of initiatory process has the danger of releasing physical consequences, either on the person themselves or the people around them. And that's why, like, I mean, when I did this, I went to Gabon to go through a Bwiti initiation, taking a boga. In one of the ceremonies, they like sacrificed the chicken, which was, kind of gross to watch them sacrifice a chicken. But I think from their perspective, they do that because they don't want that energy to rebound on people in the human realm. And often in shamanic cultures, if somebody is seen as going through an intense initiation process, actually the rest of the group will kind of back away from them for a while because they're recognizing that that danger is real. So I don't know, we're just, this is where, we're really, just at the beginning of allowing back in, this sort of psychic occult understanding of the world, and we're trying to meld it gently with our scientific research worldview. But it is, I think, important to raise these types of questions and concerns. Yeah, maybe her over there?
Hi, my name's Liana. So this last point about the tension between transhumanism and what might appear to be a conjuring of AI, and the tension between that and our desire to understand interdimensional beings and communicate with them. It's my understanding and experience, and I've had these experiences working with plant medicines, where I've interfaced with what I've come to understand to be an AI intelligence. And so if technology is like biomimicry, it's in many ways functioning or mimicking functional relationships that are found in nature, could it be that we are in some senses building a map to, or mapping our way towards multidimensional beings with AI?
It's possible. I mean, I think one thing about the high-dose DMT experience, on the one hand, it's sort of hyper-dimensional, hyper-organic, but there is a strong sense of, an almost a technological overlay there. So maybe there's a dimension where, what we now consider technology and what we now consider nature overlap, merge, and become something else. This is just, maybe I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think artificial intelligence, if that's what you're talking about, is another route into this inquiry. I don't think anything can beat the direct experience of the explorers themselves, and what we need to do is to find a way to organize that experience so that we can extract some solid information from it.
I mean, Nick Bostrom is a Cambridge University professor and a transhumanist, and he's been trying to figure out whether the universe that we're experiencing is actually in itself like a technological matrix running inside some kind of supercomputer, where they're like looking at the boundary conditions at a very micro scale to see if it like pixelates out, But to me, that's very, very, it's like a technological engineering way of rephrasing what Hindus talk about as Maya, like the universe being an illusion or a magical projection of from the gods. So I don't know, all these things may, merge into a deeper understanding at some point.
Well, just it came to mind. I've repeated this a few times before, but in different venues. But from Rick Strassman. Rick Strassman is a professor of psychology at the University of New Mexico, who conducted the first thorough DMT research. And several of his volunteers came back from the journey with the following statement, that they had met entities who said to them, "We are so glad you've discovered this technology. Now we can communicate with you more easily." I think there's a clue or a hint to the direction of future research there.
We have a question in the corner.
You've had your hand up for a long time. Go ahead.
What makes us think that these other spirits or other entities aren't already affecting us?
Oh, I think they are.
Messing with us, making us see a three-dimensional world, and that maybe those who have the ultimate power currently, like the farthest right wing, aren't using it and manipulating the rest of humanity on behalf of some other greater good, which is clearly we are not working in the greater good of
There's
humanity.
always been a tradition of dark magic, and those who've manipulated it. Why shouldn't it be happening now?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a definitely connection between what we call the Illuminati was like a real thing that was developed in the late 18th century by a kind of nihilistic Enlightenment philosopher that, Skull and Bones Club, was apparently a legacy of that, and they do rituals there where they I don't know what they do, they pee on Geronimo's skull or something terrible like that. So I mean, they're drunk, so in a way they're in a lower state of consciousness, making a goof out of it, yet they could still be making lineage connections with occult entities that maybe are more on the dark side, something like that. But once again, this is like, something that maybe in the future we'll really put some more focus into, like having a deeper understanding of.
Hi, Daniel and Graham over here. I'm just curious if either of you are familiar with the story of the Taos Cave in Ecuador, or the cave system. In 1976, there was an expedition down there that Neil Armstrong joined, organized by Stanley Hall. His daughter Eileen just conducted an expedition there last month. I'm just curious if you had anything to say about that. There's long been rumored to hold gold, ancient gold, a metal library that has the mysteries of the universe.
There's something in me, I don't know what it is, that steers away from that kind of stuff. Perhaps that's irresponsible of me, but I feel that there is an argument to be won with a powerful and dominant academic community, which is involved in shaping how we think in the West. And my part of that argument has been to demonstrate that we haven't got the story of our past correct. And in so doing, I try to stick with the strongest material. I try to meet them on their own terms, rather than to offer them sacrificial lambs. And so for that reason, I've kind of stayed away from Taos Caves and all of that material, but I welcome other people's efforts to investigate it.
Somebody else?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi guys. So during the DMT experience, a big group of people normally say that language appears to be an important aspect of how impressive and fundamental it seems like the experience. Basically, realizing that language limits a lot of how we think and how we think. So just comparing it to Egypt, to ancient Egypt, in terms of the structure of their language. I don't know if you know about anybody that's actually interested in trying to see that, like, the evolution of language as a way of seeing reality in a more balanced way, let's say. Like, what if our language limits and defines our world in such a way that we become this hubris kind of civilization? Like,
Well, it certainly does.
There's
And it certainly does. And again, because Tyringham is looking for ways, looking at aspects to research, to explore the entity encounter, language would be another way into this. And how language codes our thinking, and how it shapes and defines our thinking. If we don't have words for something, it's very difficult for us to think it, but that's because of the way we've been brought up and taught. There are other ways that we don't have to think in words. Words are limiting. The god Thoth, who supposedly invented writing to the ancient Egyptians, in a famous text is criticized for having doing so, because what he's invented is a mechanism for forgetfulness, that people cannot remember anymore, that you can't trust a text where it's gone, it's not surrounded by wise advice, and so on and so forth. So it's not a universal boon.
There's a beautiful book called The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abrams, where he looks at how it might have been, language, particularly written language, abstracted us, separated us, alienated us from the natural world in a negative sense. That might be a fun one for you to look at. And also the kind of language that people experience in DMT states is often more of a glossolalia, where the sounds you make seem to be intimately connected to the visions that you're experiencing. So yeah, it suggests almost like a different approach to communication. We're going to talk about that more. I think Diana Slattery later is a really good thinker on that subject. Where's the mic? Hey, what's up?
Yeah, hello.
Hey.
So I had the opportunity to interview a very powerful and controversial Shipibo shaman about entities, and he's familiar with 7 of them. He has a name for them, and he can say 2 of those are good for us, the other ones are harmful. So my question is, why don't we make an extra step to include indigenous people in this kind of dialogue? Indigenous people in this kind of dialogue.
We absolutely should. In fact, I think that's a necessary
Completely
step.
agree.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, Matteo runs the Shipibo Knibu Center in Harlem and is well connected. So let's talk about who would be the right people from these different lineages to get together on the conference and think about maybe scientists and shamans need to come together on this one. Yeah.
Hey, Gabriel here. I'm a self-proclaimed divergent free thinker. I think like most people in this room, it means we mutate, evolve ideas, looking for better solutions. So my topic would be about creative funding. And we talked about scientific method earlier and how our research into psychedelic experiences perhaps deserves more attention and funding, like traditional scientific projects. In most studies, I will point out that there's a ramification of the studies and an end result. And one of
capability. I imagine one of the hottest central topics in the conversation. We also discussed the high risk of some of these experiments to the individuals and perhaps to society at large. Given those parameters, I'd like to sort of call attention to projects like MK Ultra or military black budget to sort of protect public interest would be, I think, at the core of any sort of research. So given that, the question is, how do we fund and protect public interest while adhering to scientific principles and avoiding the militarization of advances occurring from such studies? And I guess after that, is militarization inherently bad in mind?
Great question. Yeah, militarization is inherently bad, in my opinion. The hatred that's swirling in the world, the way that that hatred manifests in violence, is something we need to move beyond very, very rapidly. And if any of this research were to empower militaristic interests, it would be a tragedy. Often we hear about the aliens, quote unquote, being in contact with our government and some of the secret stuff going on between aliens and our government that we don't know about. And all I can say is if those aliens are dealing with our governments, then those aliens have got to be assholes.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously like an intricate, if you look at the history, a sort of intricate dialectic. The internet was created by the Department of Defense to, have a system that could persist in the event of nuclear war and solely distribute it. And then that led to this information revolution. It was the CIA's experiments on psychedelics that led to people like Allen Ginsberg and Ken Kesey trying them, which then led to their getting out of the lab and out of those research areas and traveling around the world and becoming global forces. So yeah, these things are intricate, but obviously, yeah, there would be the concern about weaponizing this type of research is a legitimate one, and one to keep in mind. I don't really know what else to say on it beyond that. Hopefully it'll be spearheaded by people who really have the best interests of the planet in mind.